glute bridge versus hip thrusts. What's the difference? Let's chat about it.
Don't you want to look good naked?
So there's a few differences between a glute bridge and a hip thrust. The glute bridge is really just the top portion of a hip thrust, and the range of motion is just gonna be a little bit smaller and allow you to get as much out of that glute contraction at the top as possible. With glute bridges, you're really focused on keeping your shins vertical in the position and making sure that when you come up to the top, you are focused on that contracted position and only coming down enough to lengthen the glute a little bit where your shin stays vertical and then coming back up. So it's a very small range of motion compared to a traditional hip thrust where you would be coming all the way down or coming down further where your knees start to track behind you. So regardless if you're doing a glute bridge or a hip thrust, one thing that people make a big mistake on is just loading the bar up way too heavy and letting their ego take over. So I've done this before and I've realized that if we want to get the most out of what we're trying to do with the movement, which is grow our glutes, we need to make sure that we're creating enough tension in our glutes and getting to that full hip extension at the top, no matter if you're doing a glute bridge or a hip thrust. And if the weight is too heavy and you can't get to that full contraction or the full extension at the top, you're gonna just be doing a lot of work and not getting as much out of it as you want. So check your ego at the door. Make sure that you're using an appropriate amount of weight to get that full hip extension at the top. You also wanna make sure that when you're doing a glute bridge versus a hip thrust, that you're really paying attention to that control at the top of the movement. So with the glute bridge, making sure that you are creating enough tension at the top and really focusing on the control of coming down and up and not letting momentum take over. Versus a hip thrust, if we're doing, say, a dead stop hip thrust, that's gonna be, where you're bringing the weight all the way down to the floor and you're stopping on the ground and then exploding up. That's gonna require a little bit momentum, and that's gonna also bring in some other muscles in your lower body, so your quads and your adductors. We also have constant tension hip thrusts, so that is gonna be one where you aren't bringing the weight all the way down to the floor. Again, you're focused on that control up and down and not too much momentum. So in summary, the main differences between the glute bridge and the hip thrust is just think about the glute bridge being that top portion of the hip thrust. So it's that small range of motion where you're contracting hard at the top in full hip extension, you're keeping your shins vertical, and you're really focusing on getting as much tension in your glutes as possible, versus a hip thrust is gonna bring in some other lower body muscles as well, like your quads and your inner thigh muscles. Women, we believe